As class began, Mrs. Miller's voice filled the room. Sharp, precise, every syllable clipped like a blade. She lectured on literary devices, her chalk tapping impatiently against the board as she spoke. Cameron tried to focus, taking notes diligently, but every so often she felt the teacher's gaze flick in her direction, heavy and pointed. It wasn't just today. It had started weeks ago, subtle at first. A dismissive tone when calling on her, a cold glance when she answered correctly, small comments veiled under professional language, but cutting all the same. And then came the moment. They were halfway through analyzing a poem when Mrs. Miller paused, looking up from the textbook, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Cameron. "Miss Norris," she said crisply, making the entire class turn. Cameron's stomach tightened. "Yes, ma'am." "You seem rather distracted today," Mrs. Miller said. "Or is it that you believe you've already mastered the material?" A few students glanced at one another, awkward tension thickening the air. "I'm paying attention," Cameron answered quietly. Mrs. Miller smiled then, not kindly, but thinly, the corners of her mouth lifting without reaching her eyes. "Of course. I imagine it's hard to focus when you walk around with a name like yours." There was a pause, sharp and uncomfortable, before Mrs. Miller turned back to the chalkboard as though nothing had happened. The class pretended not to notice. Cameron stared at her notebook, her throat tight, her pen motionless. The bell rang soon after, releasing them all, but the comment clung to her like a shadow. The day rolled on in a haze. At lunch, Emily noticed something was off, but Cameron brushed her concern away. She didn't want to explain, didn't want to sound like she was making excuses. The afternoon classes passed without incident, but the words from English class looped in her mind like a broken record. That evening, back home, Cameron sat at the dinner table, her appetite dulled. Gina chatted lightly about the day, Chuck asked about her classes, but Cameron offered only vague answers, forcing smiles and nods. She didn't mention Mrs. Miller or the sharpness of her words. After dinner, she and her father trained in the backyard. The cool evening air felt good on her skin as they moved through their drills. Cameron found comfort in the rhythm, the focus, the control, the silence between breaths. "You're distracted," Chuck noted gently after a while, lowering his stance. Cameron shrugged. "Just school stuff." He studied her quietly, but didn't press. Instead, he showed her a new block combination, and, for a while, the knot in her chest loosened. Later that night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Cameron wondered why Mrs. Miller disliked her so much. She had never misbehaved, never shown off. She worked hard, kept her head down, did everything she was supposed to do. But it didn't seem to matter. The next day, the pattern repeated itself. And the next. The comments were never outright cruel, just small, cutting, dressed up in professionalism. "She thinks she's special. Fame doesn't mean intelligence. We follow rules in this classroom, no matter who your father is." Each time, Cameron felt herself shrinking a little more, her voice quieter, her posture smaller. She stopped raising her hand, stopped volunteering answers. She laughed less at lunch, spent more time buried in her notebook. Gina noticed. One evening, as Cameron sat silently at the dinner table, her mother reached across and gently touched her hand. "Is everything okay at school, sweetheart?" Cameron hesitated, her throat tightening around the words. She wanted to tell her, but something kept her silent. A fear of sounding weak, of making something out of nothing. "It's fine," she said quietly. Her mother didn't press, but her gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. That night, Cameron stared at herself in the mirror once again. Her long hair framed her face, a soft curtain that felt like armor. She brushed it slowly, methodically, her eyes meeting her own in the reflection. Tomorrow would be another day. Another day walking in the shadow of her name. Another day trying not to crumble beneath it. The days that followed blurred into one another like pages in a book she no longer wanted to read. For Cameron Norris, each morning felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of invisible eyes followed her from the moment she left her house until she returned at the end of the day. It wasn't just the comments anymore. It was the spaces between them, the silence charged with something sharp and sour, the glances from her classmates that lingered a little too long, the whispers that faded as she passed. At home, everything remained the same. Her mother's warm voice, her father's calm presence, the clatter of dishes at dinner, the rhythm of her karate training sessions in the backyard. It should have been enough to ground her, to remind her of who she was. But somewhere between the walls of her school and the four corners of Mrs. Miller's classroom, something inside her had begun to bend. The comments had grown subtler but more frequent. Mrs. Miller had perfected the art of the veiled insult, delivering it with such practiced ease that anyone who wasn't paying close attention might have missed the venom in her tone. A question posed to Cameron was always sharper, always loaded. When she answered correctly, the praise was laced with surprise, as though intelligence was something unexpected in her. When she stumbled, the disapproval felt heavier than it should have. It was in the way Mrs. Miller's eyes lingered on her hair when she thought no one was looking, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when Cameron spoke. It was in the tiny, calculated remarks, how fortunate she was to have the advantage of a famous father, how easy life must be when people open doors for you. And the others were beginning to notice. Some of her classmates still smiled at her in the hallways, but many had grown distant, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as though afraid to stand too close. A few had begun echoing Mrs. Miller's tone, parroting her words like children seeking approval. She thinks she's better than us. She only gets attention because of who her dad is. The words chased Cameron through the hallways like shadows, slipping under her skin. It wasn't that she didn't try to ignore it. She had always been taught to rise above, to be stronger than the noise around her. But there was something relentless about the way it chipped away at her, day after day, like water wearing down stone. Her friends, Emily and Ryan, noticed the change in her. One afternoon at lunch, Emily slid onto the bench beside her, her tray clattering lightly against the table. "You've been quiet lately," Emily said, her voice careful. Cameron shrugged, poking at the food on her tray without much interest. "Just school." Ryan, sitting across from them, exchanged a glance with Emily. "It's Mrs. Miller, isn't it?" Cameron's eyes flicked up, surprised. She hadn't realized it was that obvious. "She's hard on everyone," she said, though the words felt like a lie even as she spoke them. Emily frowned. "No, she's hard on you." Cameron didn't answer. She didn't know how to. What was she supposed to say? That every day felt like walking a tightrope, waiting for the next time Mrs. Miller would knock her off balance. That week, the tension in English class ratcheted higher. It began with the literary contest. The announcement had been made during homeroom, an upcoming writing competition open to all students. The theme was resilience. Cameron had barely paid attention until Mrs. Miller mentioned it in class, her eyes scanning the room before settling deliberately on Cameron. "Well," Mrs. Miller said, her voice light but edged, Some of you might think you've already experienced enough to write on the subject, but resilience isn't inherited, Miss Norris. It's earned." The room had gone quiet. Cameron stared down at her desk, the comment echoing in her ears. Despite herself, she submitted an essay. Writing had always been something she enjoyed, a way to make sense of the world when it felt too heavy. She didn't expect anything to come of it, but a week later the results were announced. Her essay had been selected among the finalists. The recognition should have felt good. Instead, it felt like a trap. Mrs. Miller didn't hide her displeasure. On the day the finalists were posted, Mrs. Miller handed back the class's essays with a tight smile. "I suppose it helps to have a last name that opens doors," she remarked casually as she placed Cameron's paper on her desk. The words hit harder than they should have. Cameron kept her eyes fixed on the desk, her fingers curling into fists beneath it. It wasn't long after that the comments shifted. Mrs. Miller began mentioning the school dress code more frequently, almost exclusively when Cameron entered the room. Her gaze always lingered on Cameron's long hair, the way it fell in soft waves past her shoulders. One afternoon, as the class packed up at the end of the period, Mrs. Miller's voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Norris, a word." Cameron's stomach dropped. She waited until the others had filed out, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her fingers tightening around the strap. Mrs. Miller didn't look up from the papers she was shuffling. "I've noticed your hair has gotten rather long," she said, her tone conversational, but there was something pointed beneath it. "You're aware of the school's grooming policy, I assume?" Cameron nodded, unsure where this was going. Her hair had never been an issue before. "I would hate for it to become a distraction in class," Mrs. Miller continued, finally meeting her gaze. "For you or for others." Cameron swallowed. "I didn't think—" Mrs. Miller smiled then, but it wasn't kind. "Of course you didn't." The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered long after Cameron left the classroom. Over the next few days, the comments kept coming. "It's important to follow the rules. No one is above the dress code. Discipline applies to everyone." Always directed at her, always in front of the class. Her friends noticed. Emily shot her worried glances. Ryan asked if she wanted to tell the principal. Cameron shook her head each time. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to cause trouble. But the dread settled deeper in her stomach each day, a slow, gnawing thing she couldn't shake. At home, she said nothing. Her mother continued to ask how school was. Her father asked about her classes, and Cameron gave them the same quiet answers she always did. She didn't want them to worry. She didn't want her father to know. It wasn't until the afternoon she overheard Mrs. Miller speaking in the hallway that something inside her shifted. She had stayed after class to ask another teacher a question, and, as she turned the corner to head toward the exit, she heard her English teacher's voice. "She thinks the world owes her something because of her last name," Mrs. Miller was saying, her voice sharp, laced with something bitter. "Someone needs to teach that girl she's not special." Cameron stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The words weren't said to her, but they felt like a slap nonetheless. She walked home that day with her shoulders hunched, her backpack heavier than usual. That night, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror again, staring at her reflection. Her long hair framed her face, softening the sharp angles of her cheekbones, hiding the tension in her eyes. She reached up, gathering the strands in her hands. She didn't feel special. She felt small, alone, trapped. The next day, she would step into Mrs. Miller's classroom again, and something would finally break. The morning unfolded like any other, but for Cameron Norris, the air felt heavier, charged with an electricity she couldn't name. She moved through her routine mechanically, brushing her hair in long, even strokes, her eyes fixed on her reflection without really seeing it. Her fingers lingered at the ends of her hair, twisting the strands absently, her stomach turning with a knot of quiet dread. She didn't want to go to school. She hadn't wanted to for weeks now, but today the feeling was worse. A sense of something inevitable waiting for her beyond the front door. She couldn't explain it, but the weight of the last few weeks, the pointed remarks, the looks, the constant, simmering disapproval, pressed down on her chest like a stone. Downstairs, her mother's voice called her to breakfast, the sound warm and normal, as if nothing had changed. Her father's chair scraped against the kitchen floor, the faint hum of the morning news playing in the background. Everything about her home life remained untouched, steady, like an island in the middle of the storm she couldn't seem to escape. Cameron forced herself to eat, exchanging quiet words with her parents, her smile tight but convincing. Neither of them asked if anything was wrong. She had become too good at hiding it. The bus ride to school passed in a blur of engine hum and distant conversations. She stared out the window, watching the streets roll by, her reflection faint in the glass, a girl who looked calm, composed, but felt anything but. By the time she stepped through the school gates, her body felt tense, her skin prickling with anticipation. In her first 2 classes, she kept her head down, moving through the motions of the day, but her thoughts circled relentlessly around what awaited her in 3rd period. English. The bell rang, and Cameron gathered her things, her heart thudding heavily in her chest as she walked down the hallway. She could already feel the way her steps slowed as she neared the classroom door, the way her fingers tightened around her notebook. Mrs. Miller was already there, standing at her desk, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp as they scanned the students filing in. Cameron slipped into her usual seat by the window, her pulse fluttering in her throat. The classroom settled into a hush as the bell rang, students pulling out notebooks and pens, murmurs fading beneath the scrape of chairs. Mrs. Miller began the lesson, her voice crisp, controlled, cutting through the air like a blade. Cameron tried to focus, her pen moving mechanically across the page, but her mind buzzed, her stomach twisted. She could feel Mrs. Miller's eyes flick toward her more often than usual, her expression unreadable. The lecture moved on, the minutes ticking by like stones falling one by one into a deep well. And then, without warning, the moment came. Mrs. Miller closed the textbook with a quiet snap, her gaze lifting to scan the room. "Everyone, pack up your things," she announced. "You're dismissed for lunch." The students exchanged surprised glances, some murmuring in confusion. The bell hadn't rung yet, but no one questioned it. One by one, they gathered their belongings, shuffling toward the door. Cameron was halfway through stuffing her notebook into her backpack when Mrs. Miller's voice sliced through the noise. "Miss Norris, stay behind." Her hands froze. The other students glanced at her, some curious, others sympathetic. Emily shot her a worried look as she passed, but Cameron managed a small, tight smile in return. When the last student filed out and the door clicked shut behind them, the room seemed to grow colder, quieter. Cameron stood beside her desk, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Mrs. Miller moved from behind her desk, walking slowly toward Cameron, her heels clicking softly against the linoleum floor. "You and I need to have a conversation," she said, her voice measured, almost pleasant. Cameron nodded silently, unsure what to say. Mrs. Miller stopped in front of her, folding her arms. "I've been patient," she began, her gaze cool, "but it seems you still haven't understood what this classroom is about." Cameron blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Miller's lips curved into a thin smile. "No, I don't imagine you do," she replied. "You walk in here every day with that hair falling over your shoulders, drawing attention to yourself, acting as if the rules don't apply to you." Cameron's stomach twisted. "I'm not," she began, but Mrs. Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. "You're not what? Trying to stand out?" Mrs. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Then why is it that you insist on ignoring the dress code? Why is it that every time you step into this room, you bring your father's name with you like a shield?" Cameron's throat tightened. "I didn't mean—" Mrs. Miller moved past her, heading toward her desk. "Enough," she said sharply. "I've spoken to you about this before. I've warned you. And since you seem unwilling to correct the problem yourself—" She reached into her desk drawer, pulling something out. Cameron's heart stopped when she saw the scissors. A simple, ordinary pair of classroom scissors, but in Mrs. Miller's hand, they felt like something far more dangerous. Cameron's pulse raced, her mouth going dry. "Sit down," Mrs. Miller ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Cameron stood frozen, her feet rooted to the spot. "I said, sit down." There was a sharpness in the teacher's voice that made Cameron's legs move before her brain could catch up. She lowered herself into the chair at her desk, her backpack slipping from her shoulder to the floor. Mrs. Miller approached, the scissors gleaming in her hand. "I'm going to help you," she said quietly, almost gently. "I'm going to teach you that the rules apply to everyone." Cameron's breath came fast, shallow. "You can't," she started, her voice cracking. Mrs. Miller's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I can." Without another word, she reached out, her fingers curling around a thick lock of Cameron's hair. Cameron flinched, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The sound of the scissors cutting through her hair was soft, almost unremarkable, but to Cameron it felt deafening, a sharp, slicing sound that echoed in her skull. The first strand fell to the floor, then another, and another. Her long, carefully brushed hair tumbled in uneven clumps onto the linoleum, each snip of the scissors slicing deeper than flesh. Cameron stared straight ahead, her face numb, her fingers white-knuckled against the desk. It felt like a dream, or a nightmare, or something far worse, something real. When Mrs. Miller finally stepped back, her breath came fast, her expression tight with something Cameron couldn't name. Satisfaction, perhaps, or something darker. "There," she said quietly. "Now you look like everyone else." Cameron's eyes remained fixed on the front of the classroom, her face a blank canvas. Her throat felt raw, her chest hollow. Mrs. Miller dropped the scissors back onto her desk with a quiet clatter. "You're dismissed," she said. Cameron stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She scooped up her backpack without looking at the floor, without looking at the hair that lay scattered around her feet like fallen leaves. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not yet. She walked out of the classroom in a daze, her steps wooden, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She made it down the hallway, through the front doors, across the parking lot. It wasn't until she was half a block from the school that the tears finally came. They fell hot and fast, blurring her vision, her breath hitching in her chest as she ducked her head, pulling her hood up to hide the jagged remnants of her hair. She didn't stop walking. She didn't stop until she reached the front steps of her house, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the key. When she stepped inside, the quiet of home wrapped around her like a blanket, soft and suffocating. Her mother called from the kitchen, but Cameron didn't answer. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, and closed her bedroom door behind her. In front of the mirror, she finally looked. The reflection that stared back at her didn't feel like hers. Her hair was uneven, chopped short in some places, longer in others, the strands ragged where the scissors had torn through them. She ran a shaking hand through the mess, her fingers catching on the uneven edges. Her throat tightened, a sob threatening to escape. She bit it back. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, something else took root. It was small and bitter and sharp. Anger. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. The house was silent when Cameron finally emerged from her bedroom hours later. The sky outside had darkened, the soft hues of dusk bleeding into the corners of the windows like watercolor. She had spent the afternoon curled up beneath her blankets, her body tense and cold, her throat raw from the effort of holding back tears. She hadn't wanted to move, hadn't wanted to face her parents, hadn't wanted to speak. But the weight of what had happened pressed heavier than the covers over her. It wouldn't let her hide forever. When she finally crept downstairs, her footsteps quiet on the carpeted stairs, she heard the low murmur of voices in the kitchen, the steady hum of her father's voice, her mother's lighter tone responding. The ordinary cadence of their conversation felt surreal, like the world had kept turning while hers had stopped. Her mother looked up first when Cameron appeared in the doorway, her smile faltering the moment she saw her daughter's face. Gina's eyes softened immediately, the way a mother's eyes do when they know instinctively that something is very, very wrong. Chuck glanced over his shoulder, a spoon paused mid-air and frowned. Cameron hesitated, her hand tightening around the strap of her sweatshirt. "Sweetheart," Gina said quietly, crossing the kitchen in a few quick steps. "What's wrong?" For a moment, Cameron couldn't find her voice. The knot in her throat tightened, her breath shallow. Then, without meaning to, she lifted her hand and tugged down the hood of her sweatshirt. The silence that followed was deafening. Gina's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the jagged, uneven remnants of Cameron's hair. Chuck's brow furrowed deeply, his entire body stilling as he stared at his daughter. Neither of them spoke. Cameron swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the floor, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "She cut it," she whispered. "Mrs. Miller." For a long, breathless moment, the words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Then Chuck's chair scraped back sharply against the tile floor. He crossed the room in 2 strides, crouching in front of his daughter, his hands gently taking her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face, the uneven locks of hair framing it. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but vibrating with something dangerous beneath the surface. Cameron shook her head, her throat tight. "She said I wasn't following the dress code," she managed. "She said I thought I was special. And then she made me stay after class. She had scissors." Her voice broke. Gina's hand rested on her back, rubbing small circles between her shoulder blades, but Cameron barely felt it. Chuck stood slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes darkening in a way Cameron had rarely seen. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't say anything at all for a long moment, and that silence felt heavier than any explosion. Then, with deliberate calm, he pulled out a chair for Cameron. "Sit," he said quietly. She did. He walked to the counter, picked up his phone, and without hesitation began making calls. Cameron sat frozen at the table while her father's voice, measured but razor-sharp, filled the room. She listened as he called the school district office, the superintendent's office, the principal of her school. His tone never rose, but each word landed like a hammer, precise and cutting. Her mother moved around the kitchen in silence, her movements stiff, her expression tight with worry and something else, something protective and fierce. When Chuck finally ended the last call, he set his phone down on the counter with slow, deliberate care. "Tomorrow morning," he said, looking first at Cameron, then at Gina, "we're going to the school." His voice left no room for argument. That night, after Cameron had retreated back to her room, Gina lingered in the doorway, her expression softening. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Cameron shook her head, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her mother didn't push. She only crossed the room, kissed the top of Cameron's head, and whispered, "We're going to make this right." When she was alone again, Cameron sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her hair, hacked unevenly above her shoulders, made her look like a stranger. A part of her still wanted to curl up and disappear. But another part, small but growing, felt something different. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but something colder, steadier. It settled in her chest like a flame waiting to be fed. The next morning, the house felt different. The usual quiet rhythm of breakfast was gone, replaced by a focused tension that hummed beneath everything. Chuck moved through the kitchen with a military precision Cameron hadn't seen in years, his movements efficient, deliberate. Gina watched him closely, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking toward Cameron every few minutes. They left the house early, the sun barely above the horizon, the street still empty and washed in soft morning light. The drive to the school felt longer than usual, the silence in the car thick with everything unspoken. Cameron sat in the back seat, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. When they pulled into the school parking lot, Chuck turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. Then he looked back at his daughter. "This isn't your fault," he said quietly. Cameron nodded, her throat tight. Her mother reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. They walked into the school together, the three of them moving like a unit, purposeful and steady. The front office staff looked up in surprise when they entered, their eyes widening slightly when they recognized Chuck Norris. Whispers began almost immediately. The principal, Mr. Andrews, appeared quickly, his expression shifting from polite confusion to concern the moment he saw Cameron. They were ushered into his office, the door closing firmly behind them. Chuck wasted no time. "My daughter was assaulted by a member of your staff," he said calmly, each word cutting through the room like a blade. "And I want to know what you're going to do about it." Mr. Andrews swallowed hard, glancing at Cameron, then at Gina, then back at Chuck. I only heard about an incident this morning," he began carefully. "I wasn't aware of the details." Chuck's eyes hardened. "You'll have them now." Over the next hour, the entire story unfolded. Cameron sat quietly as her father laid out every detail. The pattern of targeted comments, the escalation, the false accusations about the dress code, the scissors, the humiliation. He spoke without raising his voice, but his words left no room for misinterpretation. Mr. Andrews' face grew graver with each passing minute. Chuck didn't stop there. He pulled out his phone and played a recording from one of the parents he had spoken to the night before. a parent whose child had witnessed part of the incident and secretly filmed it on their phone. The video wasn't long, but it was damning. Mrs. Miller standing over Cameron, scissors in hand, the sound of hair falling to the floor. When the video ended, the silence in the office felt deafening. Mr. Andrews leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "This is completely unacceptable," he said finally, his voice low. "I had no idea." Chuck's eyes remained fixed on him. "I expect a formal investigation," he said, "immediate disciplinary action, and a public apology." He paused. "And I will be contacting the school board and my lawyers." Mr. Andrews nodded quickly, his face still drawn. "You have my word." When they finally left the office, Cameron felt drained, but lighter somehow, as though the weight she had been carrying had finally shifted. The hallways were beginning to fill with students, whispers following them as they passed. She kept her head down, her hood pulled over her head once more. Outside, the sunlight felt brighter, the sky a clear pale blue. Chuck stopped at the bottom of the steps, turning to look at his daughter. "This isn't over yet," he said quietly, "but we're going to make sure it ends the right way." Cameron nodded, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She believed him. For the first time in weeks, she believed things could change. That night, the phone calls began. Parents, teachers, journalists. The story spread faster than Cameron could have imagined, but she stayed quiet, letting her father handle the noise. All she cared about now was that someone had finally heard her, that the person who had tried to break her would face the consequences, and that she was no longer alone. The morning sun had barely begun to stretch over the horizon when Cameron sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. The house was quiet, unusually so, though she could feel the tension humming beneath the stillness like a taut string ready to snap. Her parents moved quietly around her, exchanging brief words and glances without saying anything aloud. The past 2 days had passed like a storm rolling in slow motion. The meeting at school had triggered a chain reaction neither Cameron nor her parents could have stopped if they tried. Word had spread faster than wildfire, first among students, then parents, and now, as of last night, the media. Social media had exploded. A blurry clip of Mrs. Miller's confrontation with Cameron had surfaced online, reposted hundreds of times, accompanied by hashtags and outrage. Parents' forums and local news stations ran headlines about the teacher who had publicly humiliated the daughter of Chuck Norris. But even without the celebrity connection, the story had caught fire. People were angry. People were watching. Cameron tried not to look at her phone. Every time she glanced at it, the screen was flooded with messages, some from friends, others from strangers, many offering sympathy, outrage, or unsolicited advice. It felt surreal, as if the quiet humiliation she had endured in that classroom had been broadcast to the entire world. Her father moved quietly into the kitchen, his phone in hand, his expression unreadable but focused. He'd barely stopped working since that meeting with the principal, making calls, organizing meetings, consulting with school officials and attorneys. His calm was unsettling, not because it was forced, but because it was absolute. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes resting gently but firmly on Cameron. She nodded, her stomach twisting. Today was the official school hearing, a formal assembly with the school board, the principal, Mrs. Miller, and several parents present. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It had become a spectacle, something bigger than her, bigger than her teacher, bigger than a simple violation of school rules. Her father had told her the night before that she didn't have to go, that he could handle everything without her. But Cameron had shaken her head then and quietly said, "I want to be there." Now, as they drove to the school, the streets felt strangely empty, the early hour painting everything in pale light. Cameron sat in the back seat again, staring at the familiar buildings passing by, her reflection faint in the window. When they arrived, there were already people gathered outside the school. A small crowd of parents, students, even a few reporters clutching microphones and cameras. Cameron felt her throat tighten as she followed her parents inside, their presence shielding her from the prying eyes and hushed whispers. The conference room where the hearing would take place was sterile and cold, lit by harsh fluorescent lights and lined with folding chairs arranged in rows. A long table at the front was already occupied by the principal, Mr. Andrews, and several members of the school board, their faces sober. Mrs. Miller was there too, seated stiffly at the end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture as rigid as ever. She didn't look at Cameron when they entered. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on the papers in front of her, her expression unreadable but tight. The room gradually filled. Teachers, parents, a few older students, all taking their seats quietly, the low hum of conversation fading as the clock ticked closer to the scheduled start time. Cameron sat between her parents, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze steady but distant. When the chair of the school board finally stood and called the meeting to order, the air in the room felt suffocating. The formalities came first. Statements about school policy, about respect, about the seriousness of the incident. Cameron barely heard them, her ears filled with the dull roar of her heartbeat. Then the facts were laid out. Her father spoke first, his voice calm but unyielding as he recounted the events of the past weeks, the harassment, the inappropriate comments, the systematic targeting of his daughter. He presented the video recording, played in front of the entire room. The grainy footage was unmistakable. Mrs. Miller, scissors in hand, standing over a terrified, motionless Cameron as strands of her hair fell to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. The principal followed with his statement, acknowledging the school's failure to intervene sooner, to recognize the pattern of behavior that had led to this point. Finally, Mrs. Miller was invited to speak. She rose slowly, her hands smoothing the front of her blouse, her expression composed but brittle. "I never intended to harm Miss Norris," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "My actions were motivated by a desire to enforce discipline and equality in my classroom. I believed that certain students felt they were above the rules, and I sought to correct that." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Cameron, but there was no apology in her eyes, only a practiced coldness. "I understand now that my actions may have been misinterpreted," she continued, her words clipped. "And for any distress caused, I regret the outcome." The words rang hollow, falling flat against the heavy silence of the room. Cameron felt her father's hand tighten briefly around hers beneath the table. Then the parents began to speak. One by one, they stood and addressed the board, their voices calm but laced with outrage. A mother spoke about how her own daughter had come home crying, too scared to say what she had witnessed. A father spoke about how teachers were supposed to protect students, not humiliate them. Several others spoke about the culture of silence, about how too many children had been overlooked, dismissed, ignored. The tide was clear. By the time the floor was open to Cameron, her heart was pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned to speak. She hadn't prepared anything. But when the chair looked at her expectantly and asked, Cameron, is there anything you'd like to say? She found herself standing. The room felt impossibly large, all eyes on her, but she forced herself to look straight ahead. I never wanted special treatment, she said quietly, her voice trembling only slightly. I just wanted to come to school and learn, like everyone else. She glanced at Mrs. Miller, who was staring at the table now, her face pale. I tried to ignore it when she made comments. I tried to pretend it didn't bother me when she said I thought I was better than everyone, but when she cut my hair, she wasn't just teaching me a lesson. She was trying to make me small. Cameron's throat tightened, but she kept going. I don't care about being Chuck Norris's daughter. That's not who I am. But no teacher, no adult, should ever make a kid feel like they don't matter. She sat down quietly, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The board deliberated. It didn't take long. By the end of the hour, the decision was unanimous. Mrs. Miller's contract would be terminated, effective immediately. The school would issue a formal apology to Cameron and her family. Policies would be reviewed, and staff would undergo additional training to prevent similar incidents in the future. When the meeting adjourned, the room emptied quickly, the air still heavy but charged with something new. Relief, perhaps, or the first faint glimmer of justice. Outside, the crowd was larger than before. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. Cameron kept her head down, her parents flanking her protectively as they made their way through the crowd. When they finally reached the quiet of their car, her father let out a long, slow breath. "It's done," he said quietly, but Cameron knew it wasn't. Not really, because the real work, the hardest part, was still ahead. She wasn't sure yet how to face the whispers, the stares, the headlines, but for the first time in weeks, the knot in her chest felt a little looser. And that was something. The story might have ended that day in the conference room when the decision was made and the verdict delivered, but for Cameron Norris, it did not. What had unfolded there had settled one part of the conflict, the official part, the one that could be written down in minutes and stamped by school officials. But there were wounds that no school board could see, and battles that did not end when the hearing was over. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as though the noise surrounding her life had suddenly hushed but not disappeared. The school's apology was printed and posted, delivered in an assembly that felt stiff and scripted. Mrs. Miller had been removed from the premises the very next day, escorted by school security, her classroom emptied, her desk left bare like the ghost of her authority. But the echo of what had happened lingered in the hallways like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Cameron returned to school 3 days later. She had insisted on it. Her parents had suggested she take more time, but something inside her had refused the idea of hiding, of shrinking away from the place where it had all happened. If she didn't go back now, she feared she never would. The first morning was the hardest. As she stepped through the front gates, the conversations around her quieted like a wave pulling back from the shore. Students glanced at her as she passed, some looking away quickly, others meeting her gaze with uncertain expressions. She kept her shoulders back, her chin level, her steps steady, though every muscle in her body screamed to turn around and run. Her hair was shorter now, trimmed properly after the butchered attempt of scissors in Mrs. Miller's hands, but still uneven in places, the memory of what had been done to her etched in every strand. She no longer wore her hood. She had promised herself she wouldn't. Her friends met her at her locker that morning. Emily had hugged her without hesitation, whispering something soft and supportive. Ryan had offered a nod and a quiet, Good to have you back." They didn't mention what had happened. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The school day passed like walking through a dream, each classroom and hallway both familiar and foreign. Teachers smiled at her too kindly, their words laced with careful sympathy. Students gave her space, spoke in hushed tones. She felt like a living headline, the girl everyone knew but no one dared to approach. But slowly, as the days bled into weeks, something shifted. The whispers faded, the stares softened. Life resumed its relentless, steady rhythm, and Cameron found herself breathing a little easier. Her father kept his promise. The school board implemented new training policies, teachers attended workshops on appropriate conduct, and an anonymous reporting system was introduced. He had not just fought for her, but for every student who had ever felt powerless. At home, things returned to something close to normal. Dinner conversations returned to mundane topics, training sessions resumed in the backyard, though Chuck had grown quieter during them, watching her more closely, his corrections softer but more deliberate. It was one evening, weeks after the hearing, when he finally said what she had been waiting for. "You know," he said, as they finished their cool-down, the sky above them streaked in violet and gold, "I'm proud of you." Cameron glanced at him, wiping sweat from her forehead. "For standing up," he continued, "for coming back." She didn't answer immediately, only nodded, her chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. A few days later, the school announced the upcoming karate tournament, an annual event Cameron had participated in every year since she'd been old enough to compete. This year, she had told herself she wouldn't. But when the sign-up sheet appeared on the bulletin board outside the gym, she paused longer than she expected. Her fingers hovered near her name, and when Emily walked past and asked casually, "You thinking about it?" Cameron had simply nodded. That night at dinner, she told her parents she had signed up. Her father didn't react immediately, only glanced at her over his glass of water, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. When the day of the tournament arrived, the school gym was packed. Parents, students, teachers, all gathered in the bleachers, the buzz of conversation filling the air. Banners hung from the walls, the faint squeak of sneakers echoing across the polished floors. Cameron stood at the edge of the mat, her GI freshly pressed, her belt tied tightly around her waist. Her hair, short now, brushed against the nape of her neck, no longer something to hide behind. Her parents sat in the front row, her father's expression calm but watchful, her mother's smile warm. When her name was called, Cameron stepped onto the mat, her breath steady. The match was over quickly. She moved with a precision that surprised even herself. Every block, every strike, every step flowing like water. Her opponent was strong, but she was stronger, not just in skill, but in something deeper. When the referee raised her hand in victory, the applause was loud, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way she stood in the center of the mat, her shoulders back, her gaze steady, no longer shrinking beneath the weight of her own name. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the gym began to empty, she walked toward her parents, her movements light. Chuck stood as she approached, his arms folded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You did good," he said simply. Cameron looked up at him, something in her chest easing. "Thanks," she replied. They left the gym together, the cool evening air brushing against their faces as they stepped outside. The world felt different, lighter. Cameron knew the scars of what had happened wouldn't vanish overnight. She knew there would still be days when the memories would catch her off guard, when she'd remember the sound of scissors slicing through her hair, the hollow feeling of helplessness. But she also knew something else. She had stood up. She had endured. And she had learned that her worth was never measured by how others tried to cut her down. The world would keep turning. People would keep whispering. But she would keep standing. Because she was more than what had been taken from her. More than a name. More than a headline. More than her hair. She was herself. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Check out other stories on the channel and share this video with your friends if you think it's worth watching.